couple or a few guests with us this morning that I want to make sure that you know who they are. One is the Tapp family, and I think I saw them. There they are. And the Tapp family are missionaries, and just for security reasons, I'm not going to share where they're at, but they are on an island just above Australia. And so we're so thankful that you guys are here this morning. Thanks for serving. And we also have the Tebows, and they were part of our team. They're in a country called Seattle. And if you've been there, you know what I'm saying. And they were part of our church planning team that left about 3 years ago, and they are just thriving, and we are so thankful that you guys are here as well. And then we also have one of our missionaries who is in the heart of the Middle East and a dynamic area. And Micah Caruth, Micah and Trish. And Micah is right over here, his wife and two boys. His two boys aren't feeling real well this morning, but they're in the mission house. And he loves barbecue and Mexican food. And if you want to take he and his family out, you call us and we'll put you in touch with him. But Micah, we're so thankful that you're here, and we know that you really need some rest right now, and so we're grateful for you. You know, I'm thankful that we live in a country where we have the freedoms that we do, and those come at a great sacrifice. And so thank you for those that have served. But we also live in a country that God has sovereignly and providentially put us in so that we could have kingdom influence. Kingdom influence. That He didn't design us to go create more democracies around the world or to go Americanize people around the world. He created and gave us the influence and opportunity to share the kingdom of God with people all over the world. And so it is a great joy to be able to do that. Well, we've been in Joseph for a while. We've been talking about detours and how those detours in Joseph's life led to some unusual and unique experiences for him. And we've been talking about how detours shape us and mold us depending on how we view them. Now, there are always detours in life because we're always under construction. And sometimes those detours in life can be exasperating, whether it's a loss of somebody, maybe it's grieving the loss of a job, could be parental challenges. But when you come up against a detour, there's a few different ways that you can respond. You can just look at the detour and just sit there and nothing happens. You can try to run through the detour in your own power and strength and might, and that creates other issues. Or you can trust that God has put that detour there to shape you and mold you and grow you. Because whether we like it or not, detours do shape us. They grow us depending on how we view them. And as we've been talking about each week, how we view the detours in our life will determine how we grow as a disciple. How we view the detours in our life will determine how we grow as a disciple. And God uses those to shape us and mold us in dynamic ways. We've been talking about the life of Joseph for this is the fourth week, and kind of the end of our time with Joseph for now. And Joseph, if you remember, he was the favored child of Jacob. Jacob was his daddy. Jacob was kind of a squirrely figure. We see that Jacob was a liar and deceiver in many ways, and then he finds that he gets lied to and deceived himself. But he also loved Joseph. Joseph, his mother was Rachel, and that was Jacob's first love. Well, he had 10 older brothers, and they hated the fact that Joseph was the favorite child. They were jealous over that. And as a result, one day, Joseph walked out into a field, and the brothers said, "Oh, here he comes, let's kill him." And they didn't kill him, but they threw him into a pit. And then they sold him to some Ishmaelite traders. Well, after that, we find that Joseph then gets sold by those traders to an Egyptian commander named Potiphar. When Potiphar brings him into his house, he finds that Joseph is very trustworthy and faithful in all that he does. And so Potiphar says, you have purview over all things in my house except for myself, or Potiphar. Well, Potiphar had a wife, and Potiphar's wife kept coming on to Joseph, and Joseph wasn't going to have any of that. And one day, she grabbed hold of Joseph, and he got loose, and he ran out of the house, and she cried foul. And then she went to her husband and said, you wouldn't believe what this Hebrew slave tried to do to me. And of course, Joseph was completely innocent, but Potiphar had to do something, so he threw Joseph into jail. Well, again, God had favor on Joseph there and put him over all of the affairs of incarceration. Well, there's a couple folks that Joseph met in jail. One was a baker and the other was a cupbearer. And they had some dreams, and they were kind of asking around in the jail, hey, does anybody know how to interpret dreams? And Joseph said, I don't mind trying. I'm not the guy who can interpret, but I serve a God who can tell you. And so the cupbearer gives him this dream, and it's a very favorable dream to the cupbearer. And Joseph says, in 3 days, you're going to be restored back to the king, back to the Pharaoh. And the baker's like, man, that sounds great. I had a dream too. And he takes the dream to Joseph, and Joseph says, well, in 3 days you're going to die. So you hate to be the bearer of that news, right? Well, sure enough, all that happens. 3 days later, the baker is killed. The cupbearer is restored. As he's walking out of the jail, Joseph says, hey, remember me? And the cupbearer goes back to his place with the king and forgets about Joseph. Well, a couple years pass, and Pharaoh has some dreams as well. He dreams about 7 great, healthy, big, meaty cows, just like what you'd see in Texas, right? There's 7 of them. Then he had a dream of those 7 cows being eaten up by some scrawny, skinny little cows. He had another dream back to back. There was 7 large, luscious corn sheafs. And then they were consumed by 7 scrawny, nasty, rotten ones. So the Pharaoh called all his council in. Nobody could figure out the dream. And then the cupbearer finally goes, oh, by the way, there's this guy I met in jail. His name's Joseph. Hey, why don't we call him up out of the bullpen and see if he can interpret this dream? And so Joseph comes to Pharaoh and says, here's what this means. You're going to have 7 great years of harvest. Some of the best years you have ever had in Egypt. And then you're going to have 7 years of famine, some of the worst famine that you've ever had. So we should store up a lot of food and grain during the 7 plentiful years so that Egypt can continue to eat, but we can also sell that grain to the other countries and we'll continue to be rich and prosperous. And the Pharaoh says, man, you are the smartest Hebrew I've ever seen in my life. I'm going to make you second in command. And so Joseph now is over all things, just like in Potiphar's house, but now he is over all things in Egypt except for those things that pertain to the Pharaoh. Well, during this time, during the 7 years of plenty, Joseph is given a wife. I don't think he got to choose, but he was given a wife named Potipharah. She was a daughter of a priest, a pagan priest, and he had 2 children. And he named his children Manasseh and Ephraim. And this is really important, what he named the children, because it tells us kind of where he is emotionally and spiritually in this saga that he's been walking through and all these detours that he has been experiencing. And Manasseh means God has made me forget all the hardship of all my father's house. Essentially, he's saying, I am now at peace, that God has brought me to a place where I am at peace with my past. And then the name Ephraim means twice fruitful or twice blessed. And he says, Ephraim means, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. So he recognizes that where he's at isn't a fun place to be. But he sees God's hand even in the midst of that affliction. See, he's essentially saying that he has come to a place of peace with his past, and he recognizes God's blessing in the midst of all of this hardship. Now, this is remarkable. As we think about just the story of Joseph, I think if we were just to kind of jump into one chapter of Joseph, but didn't read everything else, it'd be really easy to look at the story of Joseph and kind of get depressed. I mean, yeah, he had these ups and downs of greatness and favor and prosperity to a degree, but also, man, he was in the lowest places at points. And there's a number of things that we've learned through here. One, we're reminded not to measure our security by our comfort. Not to measure our security by our comfort. In fact, I think it would be more than fair to say, as we look at the story of Joseph, that heartache for Joseph was a result of his obedience. We have this idea, and there's some preachers that love to preach this idea that if you just walk in obedience and faith and blah, 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 that you will just be successful and prosperous and blah, and this and that. And you need to understand that there are times, in fact, more often than not, that our obedience leads to heartache and pain because we live in a broken world. See, obedience doesn't automatically bring comfort. It doesn't guarantee success or ease. Obedience does guarantee growth, particularly when we respond well to the detours of life. Remember, how we view our detours will determine how we grow as a disciple. So we don't measure our security by our comfort, but we measure our security by the promises of God. We've also seen how God is not the God of good things. He's the God of all things. God is not simply the God of just the good things, but He's the God of all things. Again, Joseph found faithfulness and even his sanity at points in seeing God as providential. That God is shaping and molding every aspect of life. See, the providence of God doesn't just cover the near miss, but it also covers the fatal crash, the terminal diagnosis. See, God is actively involved in the affairs of His people wherever they are. And I think there's moments where we kind of apply God's providence in an inconsistent way because we love talking about God's providence when it's favorable, right? But it's hard for us to talk about God's providence when it creates a detour that is uncomfortable for us. And yet He is the God, not just of good things, but He's the God of all things. We've also seen how God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. And, Joseph's pedigree wasn't what brought him to the forefront in Egypt. He didn't have an education. He had a great name. Coming from Jacob's kind of a big deal, but not if you're an Egyptian. He wasn't placed in second command in Egypt because his daddy was Jacob and his daddy's daddy was Isaac and his daddy's daddy was Abraham. They could care less. They didn't really particularly have good history anyways. But Joseph was qualified based on his faithfulness and his obedience. And again, what we see is that his reward for faithfulness and purity. And by the way, some of you heard me say this the very first week we talked about this, and I think it's pretty unique. There's 3 people in the Bible where there's no sin or evilness attributed to. One is Jesus. You got that one right? Good. The other is Daniel, and the other is Joseph. Now we know that Daniel and Joseph were sinners, but they were faithful and pure, and his reward for all that was betrayal. He went from the frying pan to the fire multiple times. And like we've said already, obedience resulted in more hardship for him. Because we know that sometimes telling the truth gets you fired, sometimes playing by the rules gets you 4th place. Sometimes refusing to go along with the wishes of an adulteress gets you thrown into prison. But for Joseph, his hope was in the ultimate justice and providence of his God. He had gone from the captain of Pharaoh's guard to the keeper of his prison, and now he is second in command in Egypt. And at every point in God's providence, he has been moving Joseph closer and closer to the ultimate encounter for which he was sent and for which he was created. It's a great reminder that there's no insignificant people in the redemptive plan of God. Not one of our circumstances takes God by surprise. But for those who walk in faithfulness and obedience, God uses in mighty ways. So here's where we're at today. If you have your Bibles, I'm going to turn to Genesis chapter 45. And here's the quick synopsis of chapter 42 through 44. Is that they're 2 years into the famine. So this is 9 years into those 14 years that Joseph prophesied about the dream. 2 years into the famine, the world is starving. And Jacob, his daddy, looks at those 10 sons and says, we got to eat. We need food. Go to Egypt and purchase some grain and bring it back, because if you don't, we're not going to survive. And so his brothers come walking up there in Egypt, and Joseph sees his brothers. Now, they don't recognize Joseph. Can you imagine what's going through Joseph's mind at this point? The last time he saw them, the brothers had just thrown him into a pit. They were probably walking away, because it tells us that they went just a few steps down and were having lunch. Like just kind of hanging out, opening up their brown bag lunch. Laughing, cutting up. That was probably the last thing that he saw from his brothers. And now these brothers come seeking food in Egypt, and he is second in command. You want to talk about the sensation you would have? Man, I'm going to just squash those little guys, right? For some of us, that might be our response. Well, Joseph entertained these brothers. He tested them multiple times, sent them back and forth. Then eventually, he couldn't keep it in any longer. They still hadn't figured it out. And he couldn't keep it in any longer. And here's where we land in chapter 45, verse 1. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it. The household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Now again, this testing had been going on for months, for sure, because there's significant travel. They can't just fly, from one place to the next, or even drive. They're taking donkeys and camels and other things. And so they've been experiencing their brother's graciousness this entire time. Can you imagine even some of the shame that maybe they felt? You got to be kidding. You're our brother, second in command of the most powerful nation in the world. It says they were dismayed. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." Oh. Remember me as you were walking away from the pit? And yet I don't think that was his tone. Because I want you to hear what he says in verse 5. "And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." Oh my goodness. We're just getting started. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you for a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Let me just say that again so that just sinks in. Because that's a very countercultural understanding of God. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, which was a rich, lush land, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you. For there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see. I didn't cover this a second ago, but Benjamin was his younger brother. Benjamin was born, his mother died during Benjamin's birth. And so there's no doubt a unique bond there. Verse 12, and now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and of all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. By the way, this is just a side note, but sons and daughters are always looking for the blessing from their father. Dads, you just have no idea how powerful the blessing of the Father is. And here we even see just a tiny little instance here of him saying, make sure that Dad is proud of me. Right? Okay, here we go. Verse 14. That was free. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck, and he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. After that, his brothers talked with him. When the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers have come, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your beast and go back to the land of Canaan, and take your father and your households and come to me, and I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land. And you, Joseph, are commanded to say, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Have no concern for your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. The sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons according to the command of Pharaoh, and gave them provisions for the journey. To each and all of them he gave a change of clothes, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 changes of clothes. To his father he sent as follows: 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they departed he said to them, do not quarrel on the way. So they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to their father Jacob, and they told him, Joseph is still alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. And his heart became numb, for he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel, that's just another name for Jacob. And Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. Man, that is just extraordinary. The life of Joseph, and then we get to this moment when he could have had revenge. He could have just been so bitter. And yet he chose to provide for them, love them, care for them. 2 things I want to emphasize this morning based on this passage. First thing is this, is trusting in God's sovereignty enables the believer to forgive others. Let me say it again. Trusting in God's sovereignty enables the believer to forgive others. I don't know that we always connect God's sovereignty and forgiveness, but you need to start doing that as best you can. I mean, when you think about it like this, has there ever been a time where you found yourself in a circumstance that was just awful, or maybe a relationship where somebody wronged you, but eventually it turned out for good, and you go back to that experience and you just go, man, I don't ever want to experience that again, but I wouldn't trade that for the world because you saw God's hand. Again, look at verse 5. As he's addressing his brothers who are just amazed what they're seeing. And he says, he says, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into slavery. And if you're a brother right now, you're just like, no mas. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Incredible. He goes on in verse 8, so it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. It is amazing to see that Joseph is at a place of reconciliation with his brothers before his brothers ever get there. And that's because he trusted in God's sovereignty. That despite the circumstances that he experienced, despite the hurt that he had walked through, he knew that God was going to do something unique and powerful nonetheless. That's a hard place to be. I don't want to minimize that. That's an incredibly difficult place to be. But here's how that plays out. Is that we see compassion as the motivation for reconciliation. Then we see forgiveness as the means of reconciliation. And then we see unity as the reward for reconciliation. Let me play that out for you. So the compassion is the motivation for reconciliation. Again, if you weren't here last week, you may want to go back and listen to that, because this is where we see in chapter 41 where Joseph is making peace with his past, or has made peace with his past, where he recognizes God's allowed him to forget, or at least deal with, the pain. We see true compassion as a result of divine love that has been placed in Joseph. For us to express compassion rightly, it can't be done in our humanness. What we see here of Joseph is nothing less than divine, because of how he viewed God. That it is genuinely impossible for us with the right motivation to express compassion to people who have hurt us and wronged us unless God has placed his love in us. And I love what 1 John 4:15-18 says. He says, John says, whoever confesses that Jesus is the Son of God, God abides in him, and he in God. So we have come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. God is love, and whoever abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. So God is in us. He's dwelling in his children. And he goes on to say this, by this, not by that, but by this, that God is in us, that he's abiding in us, by this is love perfected with us, so that we may have confidence for the day of judgment, because as he is, so also are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. See, for us to love rightly, it cannot, will not, won't ever come as a result of our own discipline or our own, ability to like something a whole bunch, or to even serve somebody well enough. Our ability to love perfectly, I always have a hard time saying perfect. Our ability to love in a perfect way is a result of what God deposits in our life. with his perfected love. See, compassion is the motivation for reconciliation. Joseph's love could not have come from his humanness. But we also see that forgiveness is the means of reconciliation. Again, as we've talked about, it's always tempting to try to get revenge on the Reubens, Judahs, and Potiphars in our life, right? We'd love to get revenge on them and experience, or allow that resentment to turn into bitterness and exact pain on somebody else. But forgiveness eliminates the desire for vengeance. Forgiveness sets us free. Forgiving is the only path to reconciliation. And then finally, we see that unity is the reward of reconciliation. I mean, what a sweet moment that was for Joseph and his brothers eventually, right? I mean, you've experienced that before. When you've been at odds with somebody, and then y'all get on the same page, and you're just like, oh, man, that's so good, right? That's what the psalmist says in 133. It says, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It's like the dew of Hermon, which falls on the mountains of Zion, for there the Lord has commanded the blessing and life forevermore. See, the psalmist, he's essentially expressing how this is how life is to be played out amongst those who serve God. That there ought to be unity. There's something sweet about that. Second thing is this. God is always about the work of redemption. Always. God is always about the work. Always. Most of you guys know I'm a coffee snob. Those of you who are polite just know that I'm a coffee connoisseur. And, it's kind of developed over time for me. I've been studying the history of coffee. And that's what a connoisseur does. And I've learned that coffee, at least historically, originated in a city called Mocha in a country called Yemen. Now, some of you know where Yemen is. Yemen's a small country just on the southern tip of Saudi Arabia. And the first time that we know of historically where they ground up the coffee beans, or they're really cherries. I mean, coffee's just a fruit drink. And it is. And that's why it has so many nutrients and it's delicious. And then people ruin it by putting creamer and sugar and stuff in there. And but some Muslims in Mocha in the Herrstrom Mountains ground up the beans and poured hot water on it. And they started drinking the coffee, and they loved the effects of coffee. They were able to stay awake a little bit longer and farm, and the caffeine, sometimes they were drinking a little bit too much coffee. And so coffee houses began to form all up and down the coast, the western coast of Yemen. Well, just like any kind of port city, there can be some things that aren't so redemptive. And those coffee houses became brothels. And for about 2 decades, the coffee houses and brothels coexisted. Until eventually, some of the Muslim brass there said, we can't have that. This is kind of unsortly. And they got rid of all the coffee houses, all the brothels, but they also got rid of all the coffee. And coffee this was something that was trying to be traded in significant ways, particularly from Spanish and Norwegian traders. And they got rid of all the coffee houses, all the brothels, and instead of coffee, they planted what's called khat. And khat is a narcotic that's still being grown there today, and it was just cheaper to grow, and they could sell it, literally to their neighbor. They didn't have to send it off by trading it somewhere. It was quick. And so still today, they traded coffee out for a narcotic. Well, during those couple of decades, some Norwegian sailors and traders snuck some coffee beans out of Yemen. I'm telling you, this is where it gets really good. And they snuck those coffee beans out of Yemen, but they figured they couldn't grow coffee in Spain, or they couldn't grow it in Sweden or Norway or Denmark because the altitude and the climate just wasn't right. And so they tried for a number of years. Well, they eventually went to Ethiopia. And they connected with some Coptic Christian monks in Ethiopia. And they started growing coffee. Not just any coffee. They started growing great coffee. Ethiopian coffee is delicious. And what ended up taking place is the mission movement of Coptic Christians eventually was funded by the trade and sale of coffee. Now, how's that for some coffee redemption history for you? But you need to know that God is always about redemption. Always. Even with coffee. But in our story here, it's so much greater, the story of Joseph. Here stands this dysfunctional band of brothers reeking of murder and incest and deceit and kidnapping. And yet, after all that they have done, God redeems them. God uses them. This ought to be great news for us on multiple fronts. One, that if God can redeem this clan, He can redeem you and me. Right? Who among us has a track record like, Simeon and Levi, Reuben and Judah? What good news for us. And secondly, the work of redemption reminds us that God is always at work accomplishing His broader work of redemption. After all, the redemption of this family is significant primarily because of their place in broader redemptive history. This family that God redeems preserved the promised people and eventually brought forth the ultimate Redeemer, who is Jesus. You and I sit here today not because this is just some story with characters, but because this is reality that God used Joseph in salvation history, and our salvation is connected to this. It's God's sovereign and providential ways. It's a reminder to you and me that we serve a great God and that there is security in having been predestined according to the purpose of Him who works all things according to the counsel of His will. God hasn't left the salvation of His people to chance, nor does He leave it up to us. But He saves us because we can't save ourselves. It's God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure. And so here's kind of the final thing I would say about Joseph as we kind of bring this to a close. That there is no situation, no sin, no person that God cannot redeem. This is His work and His time for His glory. It ought to shape our heart for people. It ought to shape our understanding of the past, present, and even the future. It should shape our prayer life for our neighbors, for the nations. And it should shape how we view ourselves as God's beloved. That there is not a one of us that is insignificant in His plan. But even in the detours of life, He is molding and shaping you for your good, but also for His. Father, thank You for allowing us to be a part of this history. Help us, Lord, to not look at this as just a story with characters, but that we would look at it recognizing that we are who we are today because of what You did thousands of years ago in Egypt. That we're a part of Joseph and Jacob's story. Father, would You help us see You as You are so that we can love others well. Father, would You help us continue to see You as Redeemer for our sake, and so that we can speak into the lives of other people that you have placed in our areas of influence. Father, thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.